many of your faces, and welcome to midsummer, finally. So today, as you know, when we do have our government relations live, we want to get right into the topic. So that's what we're doing. Today, we thought we'd talk to you a little bit about where we think you may want to be with APPR, or better known as STEPS now. Whatever the acronym is that we're using, we know that it's talking about principal evaluations, and we're only going to be talking about the principal evaluations today. Just a reminder that this is being recorded, and I am very pleased that Don Nickson is joining this webinar, this Zoom session today. Many of you know Don. He was our Deputy Executive Director for so many years, and Don has been involved with APPR over the years as well as I have. I want to touch on that just for a minute. So I've been working on APPR since its inception at State Ed, and then did a doctoral on it. But I've done it mostly from the policy, legislative, State Ed end of things. Don has been working as long on APPR, but more on the collective bargaining, the negotiation piece. So I think you're going to get a couple of perspectives on where we are at this point. Just very quickly, I'm going to turn it over to Don, but as you know, last year in June, the legislature passed the new law. In March, the regions passed the regulations. So it hasn't been a whole lot of time since you've seen those final regs from March till now. And just so you know, this is not a session on every aspect of 3012E or the differences. Just to highlight a couple, as you know, this really delinked the state assessments from your evaluations. It delinks tenure decisions from the evaluation. It doesn't have to be annual except for probationary. Don is going to get into that. Multiple measures, flexibility in terms of how you build this. It doesn't have to be annual except for probationary teachers. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So there's a lot to unpack on things that you may want to know about getting ready. So Don, I'm just going to hand it right over to you so we can jump into your perspectives on things.
All right, great. Thanks, Cindy. Hello, it's nice to see everybody. I'm going to just go back a little bit and clarify. We're still using APPR for those that are operating under 3012D regulations and law. STEPS is the acronym that's going to be used for those that switch to 3012E provisions for evaluations of principals and teachers. So 3012D is still APPR, 3012E is STEPS. We're going to focus mostly today on the immediate issue about 3012D that you're all facing unless you're already moved to 3012E. I will touch on 3012E planning and some of the issues, but our focus today is mostly on what happened to make you have to make a new decision about principal evaluation under 3012D, which I'm assuming most of you, if not all of you, are operating under. So there were, as Cindy said, there were law changes in 2024 that allowed and mandated 3012E provisions being instigated or incorporated into your districts. But the time frame is you have to have that done no later than June 30th of 2032. So there is no rush to convert to 3012E. And as we get to the end, I'm going to talk about why we think you can't rush to it. There was also a change in 2022 to 3012D, which said the ISLLC standards were no longer going to be the applicable standards. They were going to be the PSELs. And that was for many things, but not for the evaluation system until now, until a couple of weeks ago. That change said, as of July 1, 2025, if you're still operating under 3012D, the one that you've been under, the one most of you probably are still under, you have to switch for principal evaluation only to a rubric that's aligned with PSEL, not ISLLC, and has been approved by the State Education Department. You don't have a choice, but you have some options to consider, and we want to cover those because that's an immediate, according to the State Ed Department, must do. And I believe all, if not all of your superintendents have received letters indicating that. So they may have already contacted you indicating that the current rubric for principal evaluations that you're using is no longer going to be accepted because the rubrics we've been using were approved for ISLLC standards and not PSEL. So let's talk about what is that all going to mean? So changing to a PSEL approved rubric beginning in 25-26 is required. And they align with not just the PSEL, but the New York State adapted PSEL. So New York State took the national PSEL standards and adapted them and made it a little New York centric. And you're going to be provided with a link to those standards and measures against those standards with language about how to apply the standards. And I think that's important that you get familiar with those, because you have to use the PSELs starting this year and a rubric that's approved for the PSELs.
And those were also in large part adopted by our nationals. And as you could all guess, State Ed, of course, had, as Don said, add their own little flavor, which was a little bit more wording about culturally responsive classrooms. So they won't be a surprise to you.
Yeah. So there are two ways you can go switching to meet this expectation under 3012D. One is to do a newer version of the rubric you're using if there's a newer version approved. And we'll cover which ones have been approved and which one hasn't. If the State Ed Department determined that there was no material or significant change between the language of the old one, let's say MPPR, for example, and the new one, in fact, there was no change, then that's not a material change, does not require a submission for approval by State Ed. You can just agree to switch to the new MPPR. If there's a material change, and I believe Marzano, they determined maybe was one of the ones that had a material change. If you're going to go from the old Marzano to the new Marzano, then you've got to, the district has to submit that as a material change for State Ed approval. The other option is to go to a completely different rubric than you've been using. Let's say you've been using MPPR and you'd like to switch to Marshall. That's a material change in your plan, so you can agree to it, but the State Ed Department will have to get a submission and they will go through the approval process. So what's the status of the current rubrics? Let's cover them all. 5 have been approved for being aligned with PSEL. The MPPR 2020, State Ed says there is minimal change from the previous version, and so there's no material change, so you don't have to submit for approval from State Ed to go from the old MPPR to the 2020 MPPR. In fact, I went through it page by page. There was absolutely no change other than the date. So it's not going to be any different than what you know. The Marshall rubric, State Ed said there were minimal changes to the earlier version, but they weren't significant according to State Ed. So again, you can switch from the old Marshall to the 2024 Marshall if you're using Marshall and not have to submit for approval because it's not a material change. However, I will tell you, I'm surprised they didn't make that statement because there were some significant changes in the Marshall 2024 that I'll cover in a bit. But State Ed said they aren't significant. Marzano, the new one is the 2017 that Marzano submitted for approval. It was approved, but State Ed says there are significant changes. So if you're using Marzano, an older version, you're going to switch to 2017. That will have to be submitted by the district for approval by State Ed. McCrell, 2024, State Ed says there's minor insignificant changes and therefore no material change. And so no requirement to submit if you're going from an older McCrell to the newer McCrell. Thoughtful Classroom, they've submitted the 2013, not so new, but they submitted that and it was approved with minor changes according to State Ed. So again, if you go from the old Thoughtful Classroom to the new one, the newer one, you don't have to submit for approval. State Ed says it's not a material change. Now, here's where you're going to have some difficulty, possibly. They aren't widely used, but Reeves is somewhat used around the state. Reeves never submitted, as of this point, to what, as far as we know, a new rubric for approval. So right now, you cannot continue with Reeves if you're using Reeves. You have two options. One is to wait a little bit and see if they submit for approval and get approved, or plan to agree to switch to another rubric, which is a material change, which means your district, once you and the district agree, is going to have to submit for approval. And as long as it's one of the other approved rubrics, I don't see why there wouldn't be an approval, but it's a process you have to go through. The Vanderbilt rubric, same thing, has not been submitted for PSEL approval, nor has New York LOTI, and I'm not even familiar with that one. That must have been a new one. So there are three that were approved under 3012D under ISLLC standards that have not submitted new versions to be approved under PSELs. So if you're using Reeves, Vanderbilt, or New York LOTI, at this point, you're going to have to talk about switching to a different rubric. And I would say waiting is okay, but I wouldn't wait too long. I don't think you want to wait and get well into the year and all of a sudden find out it's never been approved and now you're playing catch up late. My suggestion would be, to be honest, if you're using Reeves, Vanderbilt, or New York LOTI, get into negotiations now about which rubric you're going to switch to, because I don't think it's wise to wait too long, because you've got a lot. If you're going to have to switch, you're going to have some training implications. You're going to have maybe some language clarification implications, and you're going to want to have your members being evaluated as principals from the early part of the year, no later than the end of the summer, according to the rubric you're going to use for the year. That's my perspective. Technically, you can wait till March. State Ed will approve changes until March. That never made sense to me. I never knew why they did that, because I can't imagine starting with one platform and then in March switching to another and having that go smoothly. Doesn't make any sense, because there's, again, not only are you switching if you get approved in March, but you've got to go through a whole training process once you get approved by March 1st. So I don't think it makes sense to wait.
So Don, there's implications then for collective bargaining, right?
That's what I'm getting to next, yes. If you are this change, even if you stay with the rubric you have with an updated version, should be collectively bargained. Very simple process. You sit with the district, you negotiate, are we going to switch to the new MPPR or are we going to switch to Marshall? Once you make a decision, from my perspective, that should be put into a very simple MOA. Even if it's, we're going to stay with MPPR and go to 2020 instead of the previous version, because it is a change in what you've been doing technically. So there should be an MOA. That should include the specific rubric and the edition or year, and provisions for any training if it's a switch, okay, for both the evaluators and principals. And in the case of Marshall, I would suggest some definitions of the new criteria. Marshall's added language regarding diversity, cultural competence, cultural sensitivity, and other related cultural and diversity issues, with no clear definitions in his rubric, either of the terms or the expectations. So I think, if you're going to go to Marshall or stay with Marshall and go to the new version, the MOA should probably come up with some clarification as to what's meant by those terms that are brand new. So let's talk about the different possibilities that you all could be in as bargaining units. You could have a separate MOA about APPR, which is what we had always recommended, right? It could be part of your full collective bargaining agreement as a subsection, which was, technically it had to be collectively bargained. It was supposed to be tied to your contract. Our recommendation always was a standalone agreement that referenced the contract. So by reference, it became part of the contract, but it had its own separate time frame for renegotiations, and it kept you out of haggling about APPR when you're also talking about money, which I didn't think was wise. So, but you might have APPR language in your current full contract, or like many, unfortunately, you may have no language. You may have sat down and had some kind of a discussion and an agreement. The district submitted it into the portal and your unit president signed off on it with no written agreement that memorialized what you'd agreed to in the portal. So those are the three potential scenarios for bargaining units. Again, I'll go back to, even if you're in number 3, where you never did an agreement or you never included it in your contract, you just signed off in the portal, from my perspective, now is the time to start to change that behavior and expectation. So if you're going to switch to a new version of the same rubric or a new rubric, at least get that into an MOA. You might want to.
And that was a very important part. I can't stress how important what Don just said is, because so many of the things that we've learned as we went through the negotiations for 3012E were because of things that went awry on 3012D, and that was critical, where some districts included everything under the sun into their negotiations and their contracts. So yeah, couldn't agree with Don more on that one.
There's a couple of real specific problems if you didn't have an agreement or it wasn't in your contract. First of all, there's no ending date to it, so there's no ability for you as a unit to say our agreements expired, we want to renegotiate some of the provisions of APPR, or for the district to do the same. Either party can ask, but with no agreement until regular contract comes up, neither party has to agree to change anything. Now, when regular contract comes up, if you have no agreement, then yes, you'd have to put that on the table. But if, let's say your contract doesn't end for another 4 years, and you or the district would like to change APPR and you have no formal agreement about APPR, either party can say, well, that's interesting, but we're not interested, and we'll wait until regular negotiations come up. So I don't think it's healthy for either party, but especially for you, because there may be some things that you needed to have changed. So there's no time frame, no ending date, no opportunity to start again. And even more importantly, there's no clarity about specific provisions and how procedures are done. What you signed off on the portal, if that's all you did, is bare bones. It's just your assurances that you're going to do certain things and meet certain expectations, what rubric you're going to use, what scoring you're going to use. Very little about how observations get done, how feedback is given, what's the criteria, is it evidence-based ratings, or is it just, as I saw in a contract recently, the superintendent is allowed to rate people based on his perceptions, and that's all the contract says.
Yeah.
I told that person that contract needed to get changed quickly next time, because that they've got a new superintendent whose perceptions are very different than previous superintendents, and it's not going well. So
we've learned so much.
So even if you have no formal APPR agreement, I would suggest when you decide what you're going to do about the rubric for 3012D starting this year, put that in an MOA. If you want to try to do other changes, the district might be willing to do other changes, but I think at the very least, it starts to set the tone that we're going to formalize this process about decisions about evaluation of principals. Okay? Now, that's all about the current requirement that as of 25, 26, up until 2032, if you're going to operate under 3012D, you have to be operating under a principal rubric that's PSEL aligned and approved. Okay, so that's all we've been talking about. I think I'd be shocked if any of you said you'd already switched to 3012E. I've not heard of anybody that's done it yet. And I'd be similarly shocked if any of you are planning to try to do it the next month. But we'll talk about that in a minute. So assuming that you're all still operating under 3012D, and you're going to continue that for a while, at the longest until 2032, then you've got to switch to a PSEL approved rubric now. And so you've got to take a look at what's your situation, what are you going to do, what are you in the district going to agree to? Does it require, from my perspective, it requires an MOA to memorialize this is what we're doing. And then the next question is, does it require a submission to state ed for approval because it's a material change in what we've been doing? Either it's a horizontal new rubric that is a material change, or it's going from one rubric to another, which is a material change. Okay, again, going back, if you're operating with Reeves, Vanderbilt, or the New York Loti, my suggestion is you probably should be talking now or soon about switching to another rubric, because I don't think there's any guarantee those three are going to submit. It's an expense, to be honest. And if they haven't gotten much business out of it, I don't think they're going to bother. So, if Reeves hasn't covered his costs for being approved in New York State over the last 10 years, I'm not sure he's going to bother. I don't know if he has or not, but my guess is he probably He may not have. There was a very expensive training program through him that was optional, not required, and I doubt that many people took advantage of it, but I don't know for sure. So
Don,
that's
maybe we should kind of move on to maybe thinking a little bit more about E as we
yeah. So let's talk about 3012E. Again, it was passed as a possibility in 2024. You could have done it for 24-25, but you must have it in place by June 30th of 2032 for 32-33 and beyond.
So 7 years.
Now, again, it may be implemented mid-year. March 1st is the cutoff for approval for change. So in theory, you could work on trying to negotiate a 3012E provision right now and get it approved by March 1st. I don't think that makes sense on a couple of reasons. First of all, you're going to switch mid-year. Secondly, there is a lot of work to 3012E. And we're going to provide you with a link. If you haven't taken a look at it, I would go and start to look at the state ed documents that came up very late this spring. One of which is a 57-page form that the district has to submit about changing teacher and principal evaluations to 3012E. It's very prescriptive. It forces many decisions. Some of them I think are going to be tough to make, like which standards are you going to cover which year for all teachers in a group or all principals in a group? It to me starts to take away the flexibility we were hoping to get. But I think we're going to have to work through how do you build in the flexibility with meeting the state ed form. But take a look at that 57-page form and you'll see why I think my recommendation is you start at least a year ahead of when you think you want to switch to 3012E for principal evaluation. So, and my other recommendation is make it effective some July 1st in the future. So it's either July 1st of 2026 or 27 or 28 or 29, 30, 31, or even 32.
Don, and if I might just for a minute, and somewhat in a year is probably even a very short time frame, because if you recall, and this is, I won't take a long time about the difference between policy and getting this negotiated, but this is really a shift from an accountability model to a professional growth professional model with an awful lot of flexibility. And some of the things that state ed want to describe in the plan are what, especially when it comes to professional, if you're at a level 1 or level 2, how you're going to move those teachers in their professional development that aligns with your district model or your district philosophy on teacher and principal evaluation. So you really kind of have to think about, Don is great on terms of knowing how to build this thing and negotiating, but it also kind of infers that the kind of model that you're thinking about for your staff. Harder to do, I think.
Yeah, and I think I agree with Cindy in that it builds in flexibility, but the problem is with the form, it truncates that flexibility. So you can choose what you're going to do, but then they want you to tell them what you're going to do every year and which time frame for which people. And to me, if I'm running an elementary building, I may want to work with the second grade teachers and focus on one set of standards one year because of what our priorities in the building are, and then another set the next year. But if our plan says I have to do 1, 3, and 5 the first year, and those aren't the ones we have priorities on, I think that's a flexibility issue, and you're going to have to find ways to build around that in your negotiations. So I think it's going to take time. I think a year is at least what it's going to take you to work through this with the district, just for principals. I think it's going to take you longer with the teachers because it's more complicated. There's more teachers, more subsets. But the good news is, finally, principals and teachers are separated in the approval process. It wasn't clear until we just got confirmation recently that if the teachers are ready to go with 3012E and the principals aren't, teachers can get approval and move ahead, and the principal's president doesn't have to sign off on it. If the principals are ready and the teachers aren't, the principals can move ahead and submit for approval, and the principal unit president can sign off, and the teacher president doesn't have to sign off. So this finally separated that out in the procedure. So either group can go at its own speed based on what's right for you in the district. But again, I'm going to really reemphasize, it is so complex that I think a year is what you're going to need. So if you haven't started now for implementation of July 26, you might want to think about would it be July 27 if you want to move fairly quickly.
And the
I
reason
think
Don and I are,
if you look at the links and look at the documents, I think you're going to get why I'm talking about the intense complexity of this thing, and it's not going to be easy to negotiate it.
and to be thinking about who's going to do your evaluation, not the teachers. But I think the one thing that Don and I have seen throughout these last years with the APPR model is, quite frankly, when we were in audiences with many of you, and we would ask, were you evaluated or how you evaluated? We didn't see many hands going up, but moving to 3012E is going to force that decision of how you are and who evaluates and how that is being done. Not going to be easy.
No. And it will be interesting to see if it changes the culture, because Cindy's right. My most pessimistic assessment is that if 50% of the principals in the state are getting evaluated under 3012E, that's good. On a faithful basis annually. I don't think it's happening, to be honest. It's either not happening at all or it's not happening faithfully to what you design. So going back to negotiations, remember everything under 3012E is negotiable, including the training. So you may agree to things like in our agreement, we'll say that there shall be a joint district and principal association committee and a joint teacher committee working on the training components of, teacher and principal evaluation. But you can't just ignore even the training in your MOA, because everything under 3012E is negotiable the way the law is written and the way the regs are written. Another misconception about 3012E is student performance components are no longer required, right? But they are allowable. So if you would like to continue with what you've been doing for student performance and the district agrees, that's permissible. It's just not required. I've heard units say, I don't want to give it up because it's actually helped us. Our student performance is so good that our ratings are better because of student performance. If you think you can guarantee that's going to continue and you want to have student performance measures just like what you have now, that is possible. It's just not required. There are superintendents who are telling people we can't have them, and that's not true. You can, but they're not required. There is no required rubric. However, in this 57-page form, they ask you which rubric you're going to use, or if it's an other, what is the other? So they're almost forcing you into a rubric. My perception is that you're probably best off using the standards and the performance indicators with a rating scale, because that's going to be the most faithful to the standards. All of the rubrics say that they meet the standards and they make that claim, and state ed says they agree. Nobody has ever provided a crosswalk that I've seen to say, here's the item in the rubric and here's which standard it meets. So if you've got to assure that you're meeting all the standards or meeting some of the standards in certain years, how do you know you're meeting them unless that crosswalk is provided or it gets done? And it hasn't been done. And it would be a monumental task. So I think you may want to consider using the standards themselves under 3012E when you get there with a rating scale. And we will come up with a model that will do that as one of the options. We thought we had something ready to go. And then when the state ed regulations and guidance came out in late May, there was so much more to it than we anticipated that I've got to go back and redo what was done for the 3012E model, because it doesn't even come close to the complexity of what they've put in regulation and guidance.
And as Don and I have tried to construct this one today, we really were just trying to, try to start out on a first GR Live, just where may you need to think right now? We know that there's going to we're going to have to do more of these as we go on and as we learn more. So, I'm sure you have thousands of questions, and I've seen many of them in the chat. So yes, we will try to do a crosswalk as was mentioned, and we will try to have additional kind of these mini pieces along as we get questions for you. So the more input we get, the better we are in terms of being responsive to the kind of information that you need. So thank you for the comments. I am following the chat closely.
I want to get to them in a minute, but I just want to quickly recap. Right now, for 25-26, you must switch for principal evaluation to a PSEL approved aligned rubric unless you're going to move to 3012E for 25-26, which we do not recommend. I don't think there's any way you can get that negotiated and in place to implement this year, to be honest. So you're probably all faced with continuing with 3012D for at least another year, and because of the new regulation, having to switch either to a new version of the current rubric or a different rubric. We will do another one of these sessions, probably a longer one about 3012E, or late summer, early fall. So as people start to think about planning and maybe getting into it this year, we can help with that. But right now, we wanted to talk about what you were facing now as bargaining units for principal evaluation, and that's 3012D requirement that you have a rubric aligned with PSELs. Okay.
Hey, if you can, just for a minute, how many of you have just, and we'll take a few questions. I know we're being very cognizant of your time here today on this hot summer day, but just by your raising your hand in your, via the icon here, how many of you have started at all discussions on E? I'm not seeing a great number of our mechanical hands go up, just a few. So Don,
right, Mark has, I'd be interested to see. Okay, a couple, right?
Yeah.
I'm curious as to whether you're finding it as complex and overwhelming as what I anticipated. That would be a question. But I see 24 questions in the chat. So I know we said we try to leave this to half an hour. We pretty much met that for the presentation, but I will stay on, and anybody wants to stay on for the the Q&A, feel free.
So we'll end kind of the informative piece right now. For those of you who think you have a good start or a good sense of where we are, that's great. I'm so glad you could join us. You want to stay on to a Q&A, we'll be on for a little while longer. So Don, take it away. And anybody with a question, why don't you raise your hand and we'll man it. We will man it that way.
You're talking about the chat questions or?
No, I would rather see a hand raised in the box so that we know who has a question, Don. We will get to the questions in the chat for sure.
Okay. All right.
Kate, what's your question?
No question. We have been starting to work. I just want to say, again, someone mentioned the Nickson materials for the teachers were helpful to break it down. AI has been a great help to us to do complex things, to pull resources together. But we also need to work with our vendors who do it digitally, who have not switched their systems yet to come to a new system. So that's kind of our hold right now, is working with our rubric scoring vendors.
Are you talking about trying to switch to 3012E or?
Yes, to switch over. Yeah.
Yeah. And when is your anticipated switch time?
Ideally, they'd like it for next year. We're going to go to probably going to switch to the Marshall rubric, switching to a new one.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks,
Mark?
Kate.
We're in a unique spot. We have our teacher plan verbally approved by the state and all in. Your sticker shock on looking at the chart or at the document is valid. However, we've had numerous meetings with both Alex and Alex's friend over at State Ed. I forget his name. You don't have to overcomplicate it. They want thorough, they want thoughtful. There is that flexibility built in. It's not a logical and coherent document. What we found very easy for our teachers, I mean, the negotiation was hard, but once we got through that, write the plan that you want as a standalone document, and then figure out how to cut and paste that into the boxes that the state has. That's better. That's why I'm really looking forward to if SAANYS can provide kind of a checkbox or a cheat sheet of essential elements, because we wrote something that hit the essential elements and explained it in the way that would make sense for us. And then all we had to do was cut and paste and tweak it to put it in there. So anything that can, and we asked Alex, who's like the guru who had stayed out on all this. And I said, do you have anything similar for admin? And he's like, yeah, no, they're kind of second class citizens here. And I said, oh, there you go. So, so anything you can provide that mirrors what SAANYS provided for their members, or Crosswalks, the similarities and differences of the expectations of teachers and admin would be huge, because their answer was basically, just do what you did for the teachers and tweak it where it needs to be tweaked. And I said, okay, where are those answers? What needs to be tweaked? And they're like, yeah, we don't have that. So anything on your end that could facilitate the writing of a local document would very much help the process, having just gone through it for the teachers, is my only.
And did you rely on, did you say NICET or state ed documents?
No, NICET created a lot of work for, or helpers for their locals on kind of how to negotiate with their districts. We have a really good relationship with our union, and they basically shared it with us and basically said, here's the checklist, here's the questions that NICET wants us to make sure get answered, and we use that as our talking points, and went from there. My other advice for those of you, this is very daunting, make it exist and then make it good. If you try and go line by line, question through question, you get bogged down so quick. So we kind of said, what's the big picture we want to accomplish? How could we do that? And then we kept going back in layers into the nitty gritty. But NICET has provided a ton of stuff to its members on what to negotiate, how to negotiate, essential elements. And we use that, to be honest with you, as the agenda for our meetings. Obviously, we kept administrative prerogative and all of that, but it was extremely helpful to make sense of the state ed documents. So something similar for admin would be massive.
Thanks, Mark. And you're right, it's all on NYSUT's website. I was going through it earlier today, so yeah. Good advice, Mark.
Mark, I may call you. I'd like to pick your brain a little bit more on that. So.
Always here for you, buddy.
All right, thank you.
All right, bye for an ice cream.
All right, Ruth.
Yeah, just as a kind of word to the wise, probably the most difficult part of the process, and we're actually I wrote in the chat that we started in December with my function at BOCES as I get to meet with Alex, and so the process was early for us, and have been working all spring on this. But the most difficult part of that for the administrator side was lining up how the PSELs were going to be scoreable. I basically had to write a crosswalk, but my tip is that I reached out to the vendor and said, when you applied for the new PSEL requirement, what did you submit? And he shared that part of the application with me. So then I was able to take how he applied. It was generic, and so it took some legwork from my end. But to make each PSEL reportable, now we have rubric indicators for each one. So.
Okay. Any other hand? Ruth, your hand's still up, but I think we got you. Okay. Is anybody? I've been listening to chat for a while.
I had one. The kind of the requests that I'm seeing are longer, Don. Probably longer discussions. Are you continuing to recommend the steps is designated for principals only?
Say that again.
Are you continuing to recommend that steps is designated for principals only? Let me see if we, yes, in both these we have many administrative titles. We use the APPR for principals only.
Oh, absolutely. The law requires principals or those who serve like principals, and that's where BOCES can get a little complicated. On occasion, I've seen BOCES directors of special ed who actually run a building, so they're acting like principals, and so they have to be included. But I think that's typically a BOCES by BOCES analysis, or in some cases, some of the big 5 districts have similar things where they have people with different title than principals who are actually running buildings or programs in a building, and so they're more like a principal than not. But that's a rare exception. I would say I would definitely not try to negotiate a steps plan for assistant principals, coordinators, department chairs. Get the principals done, and then if down the road it makes sense, maybe. But I wouldn't start with trying to include more than what's required, because I think that's going to be hard enough. I think the standards could apply to lots of different titles, but not in their entirety. So what, from my perception, you're going to have, if you want to use steps and the PSEL standards for assistant principals even, you may have some assistant principals who have a very narrow focus and only a few of the standards are going to apply. You have other assistant principals with a wide focus and maybe all of the standards would apply. The same thing with coordinators or department chairs. You know, so if you're going to use PSEL for other than principal because they were designed for the complex role of principal, I think you're going to have to take a look at the standards and say, which of these actually apply on a regular basis to any other title, and then whittle it down for those titles. I think that would slow you down tremendously trying to get something done for principals right now.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions? I don't see more hands up at this point.
I have a question. We put McCrell in for the summer of 2023. What McCrell? Who answered that? Nick. Because I don't think McCrell, let me look at my notes here.
Yeah, I was going to put.
McCrell 24 was not approved in 23. So if you put McCrell in 23, it was probably the old McCrell. But if you switch to the McCrell 2024 and you've been using an older version of McCrell, it's not a material change, so you don't have to get state ed's approval. But again, I would put a quick MOA together saying, you know, even though you did it in 23, it was an older version, I'm assuming, because he didn't get approved until the 24 McCrell. So I would say that you're changing from the previous McCrell to McCrell 2024, effective July 1 of 2025. I hope
And
that
the MOA
answers.
is just for the district, not submission to FED, right, Don?
Well, yeah. The MOAs, remember, this is all negotiable between the bargaining unit that represents principals and the school district. Neither party can make this decision unilaterally. And there you're going to have to pay attention, because I know there are some superintendents out there, I've already heard it, that are saying, well, I'm just going to decide that we're going to switch to the new version of Marshall, and it's not a material change, so I don't have to negotiate that. That's absolutely false. If you're going from an old version of a rubric to the new version, that's a change in your agreed upon procedure. That should be done through a quick negotiations. Yes, we both agree, and here's the MOA that says we've agreed to it, and here's the time frame that applies to it. I do not let a superintendent tell you that it's not a material change so they can make the decision on their own. That's not the fact, okay?
And
It may be an easy negotiations, but you have to be faithful to protecting the rights of the bargaining unit by getting into a very quick negotiations about a simple change, even though it's simple.
And as always, if questions come up or any, give us a call. That's exactly why we're here. We can talk it through, tell you a little bit about what we've heard, or get back to state ed ASAP for you.
All right, I'm trying to read through quickly in the chat, but if there's anybody who put something in the chat that we haven't covered, just raise your hand quickly and we'll answer it now.
And I will, in a government relations update, that comes into your email box, anything that we didn't cover, we'll make sure that we cover it in that, or anything new we'll put in that format as well, right into your emails.
And we didn't put it into the chat, but anybody that wants to shoot me an email, my email address is dnickson@SAANYS.org. If you have a question about APPR, send me an email and I'll get back to you.
Just put it in, Don.
Okay.
All right, all. Thank you so much for joining us. More to come. Good luck in the beginning discussions of this. Give us a call, as I said, and enjoy the rest of the summer. And look forward to working with you all this next school year and the remainder of this summer if you have questions. So, Don, thanks. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.